So last week was a very interesting week for Marvel. It not only finished up the Venom trilogy, but it also finished up the most recent of the Disney Plus MCU shows. I talked about one, so let's talk about the other. Hey guys, Caleb here from CDBS Studios, and welcome back to another review of a Marvel project. I know I just did one on Venom the Last Dance, but there was another Marvel project that finished up last week, and that was the newest MCU Disney Plus show, Agatha All Along. So today I'm going to go ahead and talk about the show and give my thoughts on it, and I've decided to break up this video by episode, so I'm going to go episode by episode, give my thoughts on it, and then at the very end, I'm going to do an overall look at the show and just kind of talk about what I thought about the show in general. Kind of like my Venom video, this video will also be a spoiler review on Agatha All Along. So if you've not seen Agatha yet and do not want spoilers, and believe me, there are some good ones in here, then pause, go watch the show, and then come back. I will still be here. But for everybody else, here is the review. So the first episode of Agatha All Along is titled Seekest Thou the Road. And this, looking back, this definitely is the most different of all of the episodes, as this episode is more like WandaVision than the rest of the series. If you don't remember, WandaVision had this whole style of mimicking different eras of sitcoms, and this episode is catching us up with what Agatha's been doing since Wanda put the spell on her at the end of WandaVision. And Agatha is now stuck in her hex where she believes she's in a true crime show like Mayor of Easttown. And it's a very interesting episode, to say the least. As someone who doesn't watch those kind of shows all that much, I still had a very decent time with this episode, as it's got a lot of fun moving parts, as this whole murder that Agatha's investigating, which turns out to be the Darkhold, which is a really fun idea. It introduces some of the central protagonists of the series. We get Agatha, we get Teen, and we end up getting Rio all in this episode. In a very short amount of time, it was a very interesting episode. But as to set up the rest of the series, it's very interesting because it feels the most different from all of the episodes, as it's kind of mimicking the WandaVision style, while the rest of the series is like this hocus pocus kind of style. So it's a little weird in retrospect, but it's generally pretty good of an episode and a very great way to open up the series. And it was just a really great time with this first episode. I think it's definitely the one of the weaker ones of the entire season, but it's still probably, but considering this whole season is a pretty good, like 4 out of 5 stars, the weakest episode is still at least a 3.5. The second episode of the series was titled Circle Sewn with Fate, Unlock Thy Hidden Gate. And if you haven't figured it out by now, every episode is titled after one or two lines from the Ballad of the Witch's Road song from this season. And this episode serves more as what I would consider episode 1 of the series than the last episode. I mean, it makes sense. These were both episodes 1 and 2 were released on the same day, which makes sense because episode 2 is kind of our episode 1 in a way, as when you expect these Disney Plus shows, the first episode you usually get is we introduce our characters, we introduce our plot, our villain, we kind of introduce all the moving pieces they are going to follow throughout the entire series, and episode 2 is more that for Agatha Agatha All Along than it is for the rest of the series. As this episode introduces us to some of the ideas of the show, we meet Agatha, we get to know Teen a little bit better, and we introduce the rest of our Coven members. We get Alice, Lilia, and Jennifer, and then also Mrs. Hart rejoins the group from WandaVision, so that's also really fun to see her again. And this crew is kind of cool. We get to introduce some of the mini characters. We get to see kind of who they are, and we introduce the whole idea of the Witch's Road, the central idea for this series that if you walk down this witch's road, at the end of it you get your greatest desire. So for many of these witches, it's very different ideas, and it ends up leading to the ending of this episode where they end up singing the Ballad of the Witch's Road, which is a really catchy song. I'm not gonna lie, I actually really like the song. And while at the same time Teen defends the house from the Salem 7, who are kind of our villains for this first half of the series. And the episode ends with our coven making it down onto the witch's road, and they begin our journey. So, very much the start, I would say, of the whole series is this episode, which I guess makes all the more sense when you remember that episodes 1 and 2 were released back to back on the same day. Episode 3 of the series was titled Through Many Miles of Tricks and Trials, and this is kind of where the show kind of transitions into a more episodic format, as from this point on, every single episode going forward, we face one of the trials on the Witch's Road. And this first one is a water trial, which is very heavily inspired by Jen, as each one of the trials is very clearly meant to target one of our coven members. In this episode, we go for Jen. And so this trial is a very interesting one, dealing with potions and that kind of area of magic, which is really cool. We get to learn a little bit of different characters in the episode. We get to see, especially because one of the premises of the episode is that they all drink poison and start having visions. So we get to see a little bit of who everybody is from the different areas of kind of what they fear. And they even name drop Mephisto in this series, which for many people who were theorizing around WandaVision were going crazy with that when that came out, which was very interesting. I was not expecting that in this episode. And they also had some great moments in the episode. I loved Agatha's whole mystery they start to set up with what happened to her son, Nicholas, which is really fun. We get to see a little bit of who everybody is and kind of get to slowly learn a lot. And we finish the trial, but the big jaw dropper of this episode is that Mrs. Hart dies. Yeah, they kill someone in episode 3, and it's Mrs. Hart, which is shocking to me when I first watched this episode. And that's the cliffhanger that they leave us on, is we get out of the trial to find Mrs. Hart is dead, which is crazy. And it just rattles your mind because you're like, oh, we're killing off people in episode 3. Like, this is serious, a serious series, which is also a reason I think episode 3 goes a little higher than I was expecting, because that cliffhanger was just really shocking. Bringing us into episode 4, If I Can't Reach You, Let My Song Teach You. And this episode is based on Alice. And I'm not gonna lie, Alice is probably one of my favorite character in this show other than Teen. I think Alice is just a really fun character. You get to learn a lot about her in a very short amount of time, especially with this episode. Is like her big skyrocket above the other witches for me personally. But this episode picks up right where the last one left off, where we are met with Mrs. Hart's death, and the group now realizes that they don't have a green witch, so they do this ritual to summon her, which ends up being Rio from the previous episode 1 was the last time we saw her. So that's fun. We get Aubrey Plaza back in the series, and she's a delight in the series. I love her performance. And it brings us into the next trial, which is based on Alice and her mother, who is a musician in this world, who also produced one of the most famous covers of the Ballad of the Witch's Road, which kind of leads to this whole episode being kind of like an 80s inspired rock music video, which is really fun. You get to have a great cover of the Ballad of the Witch's Road, which might be my favorite iteration of it. Used to be my favorite iteration of it, as you'll see my favorite one later in the series. And it just is this really great episode where you get to see Alice tackle a problem that's been following her for generations, as we know, as this episode introduces us to a generational curse that she's been stuck with for years. And the part of this episode where she finally kills it is just so great. So we exit the trial and end up at this campfire, which is where we get to learn a little bit more about our different characters. They hint at some of our past relationships. We get to know a little bit of some more hints towards Nicholas. We have a hint at a past relationship between Rio and Agatha. We get to know a little bit more about Alice, and the campfire is a really great way of setting up some of our characters and some of the future things we're meant to go for. Definitely episode 4 is one of my favorite of the whole series. I'm going to be honest. I loved episode 4, and even though it's one of the shorter ones in the whole series, I still loved it, and it mainly just comes to the fact that the rock concert portion of it was just so fun and different from everything else, which also makes it stand out. And then we finally bring to probably one of the most interesting episodes of the whole series, episode 5, Darkest Hour, Wake Thy Power. So the episode actually opens right at the end of the campfire from the last episode, and we learn that when the Coven opened a hole in the Witch's Road to bring Rio in, they left the hole open and the Salem 7 slip in. So the Salem 7 are now a presence on the road they have to deal with. And eventually they make it to the trial at the end of this episode, which is this like 60s, I think it's more 80s, 70s kind of sleepover where it's kind of like, what people would do at the sleeper, which is fun. And this is Agatha's trial, we learn out, and it's a Ouija board, which is really fun, offers for some fun moments where we get like some Exorcist parodies, which is always fun. Agatha getting possessed was one of the things I noticed in the trailer and was an episode I was really looking forward to. And we even get to revisit the events of the flashbacks from WandaVision, where Agatha's mom, Eva Nora, shows up in this episode as a ghost, which is really fun to get to see her performance again. And episode also brings us to probably one of my saddest moments throughout the whole series, is that when Eva Nora tries to possess Agatha for a second time, Alice steps in to use her protection magic on her. But when she blasts Agatha, as you would expect, Agatha absorbs Alice's power and kills her. Which, if you remember what I said earlier, Alice is one of my favorite characters. So losing her so early in the series was so sad to me. Like, I was like, no, they didn't just kill off my favorite character. Are you kidding me? But this episode also was when Teen slipped into my new favorite slot, because after we get out of the trial, we get the big reveal of the episode that Teen is actually Billy Kaplan, or William Kaplan, I should say, aka Billy Maximoff from WandaVision, as he unleashes his power on Agatha, Jen, and Lilia, which that was a big reveal for me that I was not expecting. I was not expecting to see Billy show up in this show. So that was a great episode and a great cliffhanger. In fact, this was kind of an interesting episode for me because it took my favorite character, killed them, and then replaced them like instantly. And it takes a really interesting show to do that to me. So props to you, Agatha. Props. And with that big cliffhanger, it brings us into episode 6, Familiar by Thy Side, which is kind of our big flashback episode. If you remember back in WandaVision, we had that big flashback after Monica got ejected from the Hex, where we got to see the whole events of the previous couple episodes with from Monica's point of view and Sword. So this episode kind of serves in that point, and actually is more about telling us how Billy Maximoff in WandaVision went from being Billy William Kaplan, and we get to learn some fun things where we get to see Alice as she is the cop who picks up Billy, and we get to see Lilia was actually the person who placed the sigil on Billy, which I haven't talked much about, but basically the sigil was a piece of magic that basically meant that Teen throughout the whole show could not say his name to Agatha at all, and so we get to learn Lilia put it on him because she foresaw his future as becoming his William Kaplan body was going to get possessed by Billy Maximoff. So we get that. And we get to learn a lot of things. We get to see episode 1 again, but from Billy's perspective this time. So we get to see how Agatha was acting as her true crime thriller. We get to see Ralph Boner again in this episode. Evan Peters returning, which was a huge surprise. Actually, I did piece it together as the episode was going on. I'm like, is this going to be Evan Peters? And I was right. So that was fun. And overall, this episode is definitely one of the more slower episodes of the whole series. That it's kind of meant to fill in those gaps of, how did Billy Maximoff get into Joe Locke, which is so fun. And they really did a great job portraying the character, as there is definitely a very big difference you can see in Joe Locke's performance when he's playing William Kaplan and when he's playing Billy. So props to the actor for doing a really great job distinguishing those two characters, which takes a lot of effort to do. So happy for that. What else do I got here? Oh yeah, they also have the end of this episode where we also get to see Billy breaks the sigil. So at this point, everyone can now just call him Billy, which is great, which means also I can call him Billy for the rest of this video, which calling him Teen was really hurting my insides because I wanted to say Billy so time, but I wanted to keep it a secret just in case you wanted a review on the first couple episodes and if for some reason are watching this video in tandem. But yeah, that's kind of all I gotta say on Familiar by Thy Side. And then we come to, I'm not going to lie, my favorite episode of the whole series, episode 7, Death's Hand in Mine. This episode is by far my favorite because it follows a very interesting format of a character displaced in time, which those stories are really fun to tell, as this episode follows Lilia as we see her kind of slipping through different points in time, as we get to see that she is, like, we get to go in and out of the trial, which is fun, as we go from Lilia talking to like people in the trial, when suddenly she flashes back to when she's in the cave with Jen, but it's before a conversation she previously had with Jen in the cave. And there's all these in and out points. We even get to return to Lily as she flashes back to her childhood, which is, and her first lesson learning to be a witch. So that's really fun and takes a lot of effort to pull off a story like that so well, as this episode doesn't feel jarring. Stories like this can so feel jarring if it's like, oh, we're here, oh, we're here, oh, we're here. And it's really interesting and weird because you have moments where it's like, where while Lilia's in the cave for the first time, Jen feeds her all this information saying that she already told her about it. And then when she flashes back to that sequence and she is earlier, she tells Jen all this and tells her to tell her later. Like, that's really clever writing. This episode is really cleverly written. And we also get the big reveal this episode that Rio Vidal is Death. Now, this is actually Lady Death from the comics, which is big. Unfortunately, this big reveal didn't actually play too well to me personally, as I was part of the club that actually got the leak that Rio was Death from that Funko Pop they released before the series, which was bad marketing on the team side. So the reveal wasn't big on me, but like, it was still cool. And the makeup costume they give Aubrey Plaza to be Death is actually really cool. The fact that the whole skeleton part of her face is actually prosthetic just looks so good in the episode. And even this episode ends with Lilia's death, but she takes the entire Salem 7 with her, which is a beautiful scene with her flipping the tower's gravity. And this episode is easily the best episode of the season. And if you're watching the show and you're kind of on the fence, like, I'm not gonna lie, I was on the fence for the first half of the season, but definitely after the Alice episode, it picks up. And I would say give this episode a shot, because if you hate the rest of the season, watch this episode, because if you don't like episode 8, this series is probably not for you, because episode 8 is easily the best. In fact, amongst most of the critics I've seen online, this is everyone's favorite episode. So it's just great. And that brings us to episode 8, Follow Me, My Friend, to Glory at the End. An episode title that very much indicates this is kind of the series finale, which is interesting. Like I mentioned in episode 2, that episode 1 and 2 released on the same day, and very much episode 2 feels like more like episode 1 than episode 1 feels. And episode 8 and 9 released on the same day as well. And very much you can tell episode 8 feels like the series finale, and episode 9 is like an epilogue. But not talking too much about episode 9, episode 8 is our ending to the Witch's Road, as we learn in this episode that after we go around, we find out the Witch's Road is a circle. We end up back at the shoes that the characters left at the start of the series. And this also prompts them to enter the final trial, the Earth trial, that is in a morgue. And we get a lot of revelations in this morgue. The first thing is that we learn that the witch that bound Jennifer is Agatha. So they have this whole ritual that Jen really does really quick, which unbinds her, and then she's sent out of the road. And then this brings us to the other character who goes to go on to get what he wants, Billy. As the whole point of going down the Witch's Road in the first place was he wants to find Tommy, as Tommy was lost as well after the events of WandaVision. So Billy is trying to find Tommy. So what is he? So he has this whole ritual he does to find Tommy and give Tommy a new body, we think. And it's left ambiguous for a reason. And then Billy leaves the road. And then Agatha completes the trial by herself by growing a dandelion from inside her brooch, we learn. And she escapes the road. But then she is met by Rio, now fully in her death form. And we get that classic Marvel final battle where Rio and Agatha fight before Billy shows up in a comic accurate Wiccan suit. And when I first saw the suit, oh, it looks so good. the costumes on this show are so cleverly created. And this Billy costume, probably one of my favorites in the whole series. It's looks so fun. And Billy, we also get to see some of his character development as he also gives some of it. He also blasts Agatha with his powers to give her power. And she actually cuts off to not kill him, which just shows that the relationship these two have built up over the series. And we get our classic magic fight sequence between Agatha and Billy. We get Agatha and Billy, versus Rio or Death. And it ends in a really tragic scene. Agatha sacrifices herself and she dies. Yeah, Agatha dies in this episode, which just hurts so much to think about that. Like, when I first watched the episode, I was like, you're killing off our title character in episode 8? Like, originally I was worried that this was going to turn into a Miss Marvel situation where you kill off one of your pinnacle characters in episode right before the finale, and then the finale is just awful. But thankfully that didn't happen, and you're going to see why, because I really don't have much else to say. Or we also get the other big reveal this episode, as when Billy returns to William Kaplan's room, we get the big reveal that everything that we saw on the Witch's Road was in Billy's room. Everything we thought we saw, the Wizard of Oz figures, the tarot cards, the Ouija board, the lights from the sleepover, they're all in William Kaplan's room. And by extension, Billy's room. And that's the cliffhanger we get left on for this episode. And this brings us into the season finale, episode 9, Maiden Mother Crone. And this episode actually starts in the past. We start in I think around 1570, I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly. And we get to follow Agatha as she gave birth to her son, Nicholas Scratch. And we also get to see a little bit of backstory from Rio, as we get to see that when Agatha's giving birth to Nicholas, Rio shows up, and Agatha pleads to not take the child, and she said she'll offer him her time. And this leads to a big montage or I guess a time skip of 6 years later, where we learn that Agatha has been the mother of her son Nicholas for the last 6 years, and they've been slowly using Agatha's powers to drain power from other witches and kill them. And that's kind of the life force they've been living off for 6 years. And we also get to learn that Agatha and Nicholas created the Ballad of the Witch's Road. And originally it was just a walking song between the two of them, and Agatha grew it into this big myth that there is a witch's road, and it gives you what you want, and it's what Nicholas uses. He sings it in pubs to lure the witches to Agatha so she can kill them. And this also then leads to the very sad sequence that was so heart-wrenching, is that Death ends up taking Nicholas. Actually, she takes Nicholas in the night when Agatha's sleeping, and she just wakes up to his lifeless body, and that hurts. Like, oh, that hurts. That is such a well-written scene. And she buries him, and this leads to our big reveal that the Witch's Road was never real. The Witch's Road was a myth created by Agatha to lure in a coven and kill them and to steal their powers. And the only reason it was real in the present is because Billy wanted it to be real, and so he used Scarlet Witch magic and he created it in his mind. He didn't know he did it. He did, though. And then we cut back to the present, back to Billy's room, and we get to see Agatha is now a ghost. As in episode 8, Agatha made this deal with Rio that if either her or that if she dies, Death won't show her face to her to take her to the afterlife. Meaning, Agatha stays on the mortal plane as a ghost, which is really fun. I love Catherine Hahn's portrayal of this ghost. And, of course, at this point, Billy's not having it. He goes back to her basement to banish her using her brooch, but she reveals that she won't leave because she can't see herself facing Nicholas. And that's such an emotional scene, because you really get to see how these two have bonded over the series and really became, I wouldn't say friends, but more or less allies at least. And the series ends in this kind of ambiguous ending where Billy and Agatha head off into the world to go find Tommy. And that's how we end Agatha All Along. So, to move into some of my overall thoughts on the series, I actually really enjoyed Agatha. Well, more or less, I enjoyed it later on in its run. I was definitely part of the club that was skeptical on the series. I definitely think episodes 1 through 3 are not the greatest introduction to the series. Of course, like all TV shows, usually you got to build up your characters and all that. And so, for those first 2 weeks of the show, where we got episodes 1, 2, and 3, I was skeptical. I was hearing a bunch of stuff online as well as I was watching it that the show was not that great. People weren't enjoying it, and people were saying that like if it wasn't, because like some people got to actually see the first 4 episodes before the show released in like movie theaters, and they were saying that like the show, if they didn't just play all 4 episodes back to back to back, they probably would have turned it off. So I was definitely in the boat that episodes 1 through 3 are very slow, but from the episode 4 onwards, each week started to get better as we just went from a good episode to a great episode to a better episode to an amazing episode. Like this show ramps up. I will admit that the ending is a little interesting. Marvel is notorious. I mentioned this a lot in my MCU ranking video. If you haven't seen that lots of the Disney Plus shows that I think are good or I think are good are ruined by their finales. And this episode feels weird because the finale is not the finale, as we got episode 8, like I mentioned, is more or less the traditional Marvel finale, where we have our big epic final battle in superhero costumes, and episode 9 is more of an epilogue, as it's less of, oh, we're going to have our big final battle, and then we're just going to end the series. It's, we had our big battle in episode 8, so episode 9 is more of answering those small questions of, what happened to Nicholas? What's the secret of the Witch's Road? What's Agatha and Billy doing now? Or what are they going to do next? And that's kind of what this series ends on. And I will admit that while episode 9 is definitely not as great as episode 8, it's still a really solid finale. I think Agatha is one of the better Disney Plus shows. As also, you got to look at the other argument that Agatha All Along, I think, is one of the only Disney Plus shows that feels like a show. So many of the Disney Plus shows, like I even think I mentioned this a couple times in my MCU ranking video, that these shows oftentimes feel like movies that Marvel chopped up into 6 like episodes, or they stretched it out to fit 6 episodes, and then it just feels like either there's bad parts that go on for too long or not enough to sustain 6 episodes. So there's definitely series that feel like that. Some that come to mind instantly, episode shows like Falcon and the Winter Soldier and Miss Marvel come to mind instantly, of shows that I think didn't have enough to supply that full 6 episodes. But this show feels like there was enough content to fit the 9 episodes they went for, as it doesn't feel like any episode overstays its welcome. Even some of the, like I mentioned, episode 3 is not one of my favorite episodes, but it's like one of the shortest episodes of the season, so it doesn't overstay its welcome, thankfully. But yeah, so I think it's a really solid show, and I think that, like I think I mentioned this a couple times in my MCU ranking video, but this Marvel definitely took a step back this year, as this year in 2024, after all the backlash they've been getting from Phase 4 and the start of Phase 5 with all the stuff that happened back there, and they were getting a lot of backlash. Of course, plans changed with the multiverse saga, so Marvel said, all right, we're going to take a step back, and the only things that are going to release this year are Deadpool and Wolverine and Agatha All Along. And of course, now we know What If Season 3 is coming this December, but that was not on the agenda for a long time. But so they took a step back, and I'm going to say it, and I think I mentioned this when I talked about Deadpool and Wolverine in my MCU ranking video, that Deadpool and Wolverine and Agatha feel like what Marvel used to be. As Deadpool and Wolverine feels like a movie that was taken straight out of the Infinity Saga in a way, and Agatha All Along, I think, matches some of the heights from WandaVision and Loki, which are some of my favorite Disney Plus shows. So I think that Agatha All Along is a solid show. I would give it personally an 8 out of 10 or a 4 out of 5 stars. I think that's where that belongs for me on the scale, as it's definitely not perfect. There are problems here and there, like I mentioned. The first 3 episodes are not great, and I think the show, in a lot of ways, also thinks it's clever, more clever than it is. Like, I'm not gonna lie, the big reveal that Billy created the Witch's Road was something I kind of saw coming, especially after I was one of the people that did pick up on some of those clues in episode 6 about William Kaplan's room having a lot of elements of the Witch's Road in it. I wasn't sure what they were going to do with it. I thought it was going to be it was shaped, or like the Witch's Road designs itself to be kind of based on the Coven, so it just take a lot of inspiration from William Kaplan's room. But so it didn't have the big, like, the death reveal was revealed ahead of time. I think the only big reveals that got me were the Alice death and Joe Locke's teen character turning out to be William Kaplan, aka Billy Maximoff. I think those were the only big reveals that got me. But overall, I think this is a really solid show, and it makes me hopeful for the future. Of course, as the directors have kind of mentioned in previous years that, and they've mentioned as the show is coming out, that Agatha All Along is part 2 of this WandaVision trilogy, and it's going to end with Vision Quest. So who knows? Maybe the next time we're going to see Billy and Agatha is in Vision Quest, and it's going to involve some kind of hunt for Tommy. Who knows? But I definitely think WandaVision and Agatha are already pretty decent shows. So if Vision Quest can stick the landing, I think it's going to be an okay trilogy. So there you guys have it. That is my review of Agatha All Along. To give my final verdict, if you have not yet checked out Agatha, I'd recommend it. At least give it a shot. It's definitely going to have a few episodes in there that are kind of off, but it definitely has some really solid episodes. As I know people are going to keep telling us in the world that there is a Marvel fatigue, there's a superhero fatigue. That's not true. There is not a superhero fatigue or an MCU fatigue. There's a bad writing fatigue. We hate badly written projects. And if you look at many of the Marvel, just superhero projects in general, at least in the last 3 years, it's easy to see why. There is a lot of stinkers in this genre in the last couple years alone. But Agatha is not that. It at least has some great moments that are worth checking out. And I'd recommend watching it if you haven't already. If you guys have already seen the show, drop some comments down below. Tell me what you thought of the show, and maybe we can get some conversations going. And if you guys like what you see over here on the channel from the review videos and the ranking videos that I've been doing, drop a like down below and subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. I have a lot of really fun videos coming up talking about the future of Marvel, and a couple of ranking videos that I have planned out and also are going to be coming soon as per the vote that came out on my channel a couple days ago. But until those videos, hope you guys have a great day. I hope to see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys!